The train screeches to a halt against the rusted platform of Sector 7, and for the first time in 36 years, I am actually stepping off and looking up. For decades, I have avoided this place. I have watched the hype from a safe distance and looked at the screenshots of a spiky-haired guy with a sword the size of a surfboard. In the landscape of the PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII isn't just a game, it is a weather system. It is inescapable. But I was never an RPG guy. My heart belongs to the claustrophobic dread of a survival horror save room, where every bullet is a tactical decision and the story is told in bloodstains. The only reason I ever touched Parasite Eve was because it looked like a police procedural with a monster problem. I only played it because I already knew the character. I had the hook. Stepping into Midgar, I had nothing. I don't have a childhood nostalgia that acts as a shield against the blocky, low poly aesthetics. I don't have a favourite character. I don't even know how to navigate a blue menu box without feeling a slight sense of tactical panic. But you can't document the PlayStation without reckoning with the giant in the room. You can't complete the PSX index without paying respects to the game that fundamentally shifted the tectonic plates of the industry. I'm walking into this cold, trying to understand why a generation of people treated these 3 black discs like a religious text. I'm trading my shotgun for a spellbook, my instincts for a turn-based timer, and my skepticism for a 70-hour commitment. The reactor is primed, the timer is counting down, and it's time to see if the legend actually lives up to 25 years of noise, or if I'm just another tourist lost in the slums. This is the big one, this is the pivot. Let's see if I can find the heart inside the machine.
Beyond the edge of reality lies a story of ultimate conquest, a story of war and friendship, a story of a love that can never be, and a hatred that always was. And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
PlayStation.
Welcome back to the PSX Index. I'm Parasan. This is a long-term project to document all 1,278 North American PlayStation games, one episode at a time. This is Index Entry 46, Final Fantasy VII, and for the first time since I started this journey, I feel like I'm standing at the front of a mountain with no hiking gear and a very poor map. I've spent most of my gaming life avoiding the long play. I've always been drawn to games that are dense, short and visceral. The kind of experiences where you can see the credits before the sun comes up. JRPGs, by contrast, always felt like a second job. They felt like a commitment to 60 hours of menus, stat tracking and random encounters I just wasn't prepared to sign a contract for. The only real exception on my past was Parasite Eve, but even then, I was a tourist. I liked the cinematic pacing and the fact that it didn't overstay its welcome. It was an RPG for people who didn't like RPGs. But Final Fantasy VII, this is the pure stuff. This is 3 discs of world-ending stakes, complex systems, and a narrative that famously requires a notebook to keep track of the conspiracies. Growing up in the UK, this game was an absolute monolith. Even if you didn't play it, you knew the music. You knew the names. You knew that it was the reason your friends stopped coming outside for 3 weeks in the summer of 1997. I've always felt like I was missing a piece of the puzzle by leaving this game on the shelf. It's a massive glowing blind spot in my history as a gamer, but part of the challenge of the PSX Index is the forced encounter. I can't just play the games I already love. I have to confront the legends that built the platform. So I'm going in with this with a completely clean slate. I'm putting aside my preferences for fast-paced action and I'm trying to learn the language of an active time battle. I want to see if the magic is still there when you strip away 30 years of hyperbole and look at these blocky, low-poly models through the eyes of a first-timer in 2026. I'm expecting to get lost. I'm expecting to spend far too much time trying to figure out why my sword is glowing and which materia slot I've managed to mess up. And I'm expecting to finally understand why this specific collection of code convinced millions of people that a blue menu box could be a source of a high drama. This isn't just another entry on the list. For me, this is a rite of passage. It's the moment the index stops being a checklist and starts being an education. I'm not a fan. Not yet anyway. I'm just a guy with a controller and a lot of questions. and it all starts in the dirt. When you finally gain control of Cloud Strife, the first thing that hits you isn't magic or monsters, it's the filth. Coming from the polished gothic halls of other classic adventures, Midgar feels less like a fantasy kingdom and more like a decaying lung. It's a world built on layers, where the wealthy live on a literal steel plate, blocking out the sun for the millions of people living in the dirt below. As someone who thrives on atmosphere, this was my first real in. I might not understand the menus yet, but I understand the grime. There is a heavy industrial weight on the pre-rendered backgrounds that makes the world feel lived in and exhausted. Everything is rusted, everything's leaking, and everything feels like it's being held together by spite and bad wiring. It's a bold choice for a game that was supposed to be the next big thing. Usually you want your high big budget epic to start somewhere beautiful. You want rolling green hills and blue skies, but Final Fantasy VII starts you in a dump. It drops you in a labyrinth of scrap metal and neon lights, forcing you to navigate a city that feels like it's actively digesting itself. There's a specific loneliness in the slums that I wasn't expecting. You wander through Sector 7 and you see the mundane details of poverty, the broken down buses repurposed as houses, the flickering TVs in the corner of a bar, the way the people would talk with a weary sort of resignation. It doesn't feel like a quest, it feels like a struggle, and for the first timer, that grounded reality is the bridge that lets you cross over into the more fantastical elements. I spent a lot of time just standing still, soaking in the way the light hits the pipes and the puddles. Even though the resolution is low by modern standards, the art direction is doing the heavy lifting. It's telling a story about a class warfare and an environmental collapse without saying a single word. You look up and you see the massive, oppressive underside of the plate, and you immediately understand why the people down here are angry. For me, this was the culture shock of the genre. I expected high fantasy tropes and knights in shining armour. Instead, I got a world that smells like diesel and wet cardboard. It's gritty in a way that feels surprisingly modern, and it gave me a reason to keep pushing forward. I didn't care about the save the world stakes yet. I just wanted to see if anyone in this city actually managed to find a way to see the sun. It's a masterful bit of world building that makes the transition into the RPG elements feel earned. You aren't just fighting for XP, you're fighting because the air in Midgar is too thick to breathe and the people at the top of the plate don't care if you choke. I might be an outsider to the genre, but I know a good setting when I see one. And Midgar is a masterpiece of a misery. Once you settle into the atmosphere of the slums, you have to confront the most famous visual hurdle in gaming history, the Popeye arms. This is a bizarre, almost surreal contrast at the heart of Final Fantasy VII's presentation. On one hand, you have these incredibly detailed cinematic pre-rendered backdrops that look like a concept art came to life. On the other hand, you have the characters. Little blocky, super deformed puppets with spheres for hands and triangles for feet. Coming into this as a first timer in 2026, it is undeniably jarring. We've been spoiled by decades of motion capture and realistic facial animations, so seeing a global icon like Cloud Strife look like a collection of primary school coloured Lego bricks is a bit of a trip. When I first saw him shrug or shake his head, it felt like I was watching a high-stakes political thriller being performed by Duplo figures. And then, something strange happens. The longer you play, the more your brain starts to perform a sort of digital alchemy. Because the characters lack detailed faces or realistic proportions, you find yourself projecting the emotion onto them. When a character slumps their shoulders or shakes their head, the simplicity of the animation actually makes the feeling clearer. It's like reading a comic book or watching a puppet show. The abstraction allows the heart of the scene to come through without the distraction of the uncanny valley realism. I realised that this was a necessity of the era. Squaresoft was trying to tell a story of unprecedented scale on hardware that was still finding its legs. They couldn't give you high fidelity models in the field and still fit this entire world onto 3 discs. So they made a trade. They gave us symbols of characters in the world and saved the real versions of them for the combat screens and the CG cutscenes. It creates this weird rhythmic shift in your perception. In the field, Cloud is a blocky little guy trying to find his way through a maze, but as soon as the screen swirls and the battle music kicks in, he transforms. Suddenly, he's a tall, lean, realistically proportioned warrior. It's like the game is constantly reminding you of the scale of its own imagination. It's saying, this is what he looks like to the world, but this is how he feels when his sword is out. I actually find the LEGO version charming now. There's a sincerity to them. They don't have the benefit of a $100 million facial capture rig to tell you they're sad. They have to do it with a tilt of a blocky head and a text box. It forces the writing and the music to do the heavy lifting, and as a result, the story feels more like a piece of theatre than a movie. I stopped seeing the polygons after 3 hours. I stopped seeing the spheres for hands and started to see the weight of the characters' burdens. It's a testament to the art direction that these little puppets can carry a story this heavy without feeling like a parody. It's a visual language that we've mostly lost in the pursuit of realism, and revisiting it as an adult and as an outsider is a reminder that you don't need 1,000,000 pixels to tell a human story. You just need a good script and a world that feels worth saving. As a guy who usually spends his time in games trying to bait an enemy into an animation cycle so I can land a precise headshot, the combat in Final Fantasy VII felt like being asked to play chess in the middle of a nightclub. This is where the active time battle system, or ATB, comes into play. It's the game's way of saying, I know this is turn-based, but I'm still going to make your palms sweat. The anxiety part of the ATB is the waiting. You have a little blue bar that fills up over time. You can't do a single thing until it hits the end. Those few seconds feel like an eternity. You're standing there, watching a giant mechanical scorpion prime its laser, and you're just waiting, practically trying to pull it to the right with your mind, while your characters stand there doing a little idle bob. This is a bizarre psychological trick. In a traditional turn-based game, the world stops and waits for you to think. It's polite, but Final Fantasy VII isn't polite. The enemies don't care if you're still reading the menu. If their bar fills up before yours, they're going to hit you. It turns the simple act of choose and attack into a race. I found myself frantically scrolling through the sub-menus, my eyes darting between the health points and the enemy stance, feeling a very specific type of menu-induced panic. It's a different kind of skill than the one I'm used to. It's not about reflexes in the thumbsticks, it's about the speed of your decision making. You have to commit. If you spend too long wondering if you should have a potion or a bolt spell, you're just giving the enemy a free round. As an RPG outsider, I had to learn to stop overthinking and start trusting the rhythm. There's a musicality in the combat, a back and forth flow that eventually becomes second nature. The early hours were rough. I accidentally clicked defend because I was rushing, or I'd target the wrong enemy because the cursor moved faster than my brain. And then there's the limit break system. When you take enough damage, you get a special high-powered move. The first time that yellow bar flashed and I saw cross/slash appear, I felt a genuine surge of adrenaline. It's the game's way of rewarding you for surviving the stress. It's the clunch moment in the genre that I previously thought was just about math. I'm starting to realise that the ATB system is the secret sauce. It bridges the gap between the slow, calculated strategy of the old school JRPGs and the cinematic intensity of the PlayStation era. It makes the combat feel like a fight, not a spreadsheet, even if I'm still just clicking on the words in a blue box. The timing of those clicks makes me feel like I'm actually in the struggle. I might still be an amateur at the math of the game, but I'm starting to appreciate the beat. If the ATB system is the engine of this game, then Materia is the fuel, the exhaust. and the steering wheel all at once. For an RPG novice, this is the part of the game where the mountain starts to look very steep. In most games I play, a sword is a sword. You find a better one, you equip it, and it hits things harder. But in Final Fantasy VII, your weapon is essentially just a specialised piece of hardware designed to hold glowing marbles of condensed planetary energy. Trying to wrap my head around Materia for the first time felt like starting a chemistry degree in the middle of a war zone. You have these coloured orbs, green for magic, red for summons, yellow for commands, and you have to slot them in your gear. It sounds simple until you realise that your gear has linked slots. This is where the maths started to hurt my head. If I put a fire materia next to an all materia, I could hit every enemy on the screen. If I don't, I'm just wasting my time. I spent a lot of time just staring at the menu, moving marbles around like a confused jeweller. I had this constant low-level anxiety that I was doing something wrong. I'd find new materia, read the description, and realised I had no idea how it interacted with 6 other things I was carrying. It turned the inventory screen into a puzzle game. You aren't just managing items, you're building a character's entire identity through a series of tactical what-ifs. But there's a profound sense of satisfaction when it finally clicks. The first time I successfully linked an elemental materia to my weapon and saw Cloud's sword glowing with ice, I felt like a genius. I realised that the game wasn't just giving me spells, it was giving me a toolkit. It allows for a level of customisation that still feels incredibly modern for 1997. You can turn your heavy hitter into a healer, or a mage into a tank, just by swapping a few stones. It removes the rigidity of character classes and replaces them with a system that rewards experimentation. However, the rabbit hole goes deeper. Materia levels up. It absorbs AP from your battles and eventually births a new version of itself when it's mastered. This was the moment I realised the scale of the commitment I'd made. I wasn't just playing through a story, I was tending a digital garden. I found myself getting protective of my materia, checking their growth after every fight like a proud parent. I think this is why people get so obsessed with this game. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the build. It's the feeling of taking a pile of abstract concepts and turning them into a cohesive, unstoppable force. I might still be an amateur, and I'm almost certain that a veteran player would look at my current setup and weep. But for the first time in an RPG, I feel like I'm actually in control of the machine. I'm not just following a path, I'm designing the engine that's going to carry me to the end of the world. For the first several hours of the game, Final Fantasy VII does something brilliant, and in hindsight, incredibly deceptive. It convinces you that Midgar is the game. You spend so much time in those alleys, climbing those plates and fighting through those reactors that your brain begins to map into the boundaries of the world. You start to think, okay, I get it. This is a cyberpunk story set in a massive dystopian city. I've mastered the subway, I know the slums, and I'm ready for the final act. And then, you climb the rope, you fight your way out the Shinra building, you cross the highway, and you reach the edge of the city. For a first timer, this is the holy crap moment that defines the entire experience. You step out onto the grass, the camera pulls back, and the heavy, industrial music of the city is replaced by the sweeping, hopeful stings of the main theme. Suddenly, Midgar, the massive, oppressive metropolis you just spent hours surviving, is reduced to a tiny smoking dot on the horizon that stretches forever. Coming from a background of more contained games on the PlayStation, this felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. It was a physical sensation of vertigo. I wasn't just in a city anymore, I was on a planet. This is the moment where the scale of the 90s ambition truly hit you. The world map isn't just a menu or a fast travel screen. It's a vast, open frontier filled with hidden towns, mountain ranges, and oceans you actually have to traverse. It changed my perspective on the long play entirely. I realised that everything I had done up to that point was just the prologue. The stakes had shifted from the eco-terrorism in a city to a survival of the world. As a player, it's both exhilarating and terrifying. You feel small, you realise the giant kitchen knife on Cloud's back is just one tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. It's the moment the game stops being a directed narrative and starts being an adventure. I spent a good 10 minutes just running around in circles on green grass, looking at the tiny models of my characters against the vast landscape. There's a sense of freedom in a transition that modern open world games struggle to replicate because they don't have that contained first act to contrast it against. You have to earn the world. You have to survive the darkness of the slums before the game allows you to see the sun. This was the moment I finally got the appeal of the genre's length. It's about the journey. It's about the distance travelled between where you started and where you're going. Midgar was a prison, but the world map is a promise. I looked at the mountains in the distance and realised that I was probably going to have to cross them. I was no longer just a tourist in a city. I was a traveller on a mission. And for the first time, I wasn't worried about how many hours were left on the clock. I just wanted to see what was over the next hill. In my world of survival horror, the monster is usually right in your face. He's crashing through a window and sprinting through an alleyway with a rocket launcher. You know where he is because you can hear his boots. But Final Fantasy VII handles its antagonist with a level of restraint that I found genuinely unsettling. For a massive portion of the game, Sephiroth isn't a character you fight, he's a ghost you follow. I was waiting for a big confrontation. I expected the final boss to show up and give a speech for the first 10 hours. Instead, the game gives you a trail of bodies. You arrive at the top of the Shinra building and find the most powerful man in the world slumped over a desk with a 6-foot blade buried in his back. You don't see the attack, you just see the aftermath. It's a masterful bit of psychological build-up. The game is telling you this guy is far out your league and he doesn't even need to stay and gloat. This shadow follows you across the entire world. You enter a new town and the people are whispering about a man with a black cape. You find a Midgar Zolom, a giant serpent that was a terrifying boss for me just an hour earlier, impaled on a tree like a common earthworm. The message is clear. The thing you're hunting is a god, and you're just a guy with some glowing marbles. Coming into this without childhood nostalgia, I was surprised by how effective this was. Sephiroth isn't scary because of how he looks, though the silver hair and the black coat are iconic for a reason. He's scary because of the silence he leaves behind. He is a force of nature that is always 3 steps ahead of you, carving a path through the world that you are simply trying to clean up. When you finally get a glimpse of his power during a flashback sequence in Calm, the math of the game reinforces the horror. You're level 10, struggling to kill a bug, and he's standing next to you, doing 3,000 damage in a single swing. As a player, it's a humbling experience. It makes the grind feel necessary. You aren't just leveling up because the game told you to. You're leveling up because you've seen the gap between you and the predator, and you're desperately trying to close it. I find this approach to the villainy fascinating. It's not just about jump scares and constant pursuit. It's about reputation. By the time you actually stand face to face with him, the game has spent 40 hours making sure you're intimidated. It turns the final confrontation into something much more than just a fight. It's an exorcism of the fear the game has been planting in you since Disc 1. I might be new to the JRPG world, but I recognise a legendary villain when I see one. Sephiroth isn't just a boss, he's the reason you keep your finger on the save button. If you were to look at the marketing for Final Fantasy VII, you'd think you were signing up for a somber, brooding epic about the death of a planet and the existential crisis of a mercenary, and for about 80% of the time, that is exactly what you get. But then, without warning, the game decides to pivot into some of the most bizarre, surreal, and downright hilarious diversions I've ever seen in a medium that is supposedly serious. Coming from a background where levity usually means finding a slightly less gruesome note on a corpse, the tonal whiplash of this game hit me like a freight train. 1 minute, you are mourning the destruction of an entire city sector. The next, you're dressed in a wig and a silk dress, trying to convince a sleazy mansion owner that you are the most beautiful girl in the room. There is no middle ground. As a first timer, these moments are where my dry British sensibility really kicked in. I find myself sitting on my sofa, staring at a screen of Cloud Strife, doing a rhythmic bass squats in a gym full of bodybuilders to win a blonde wig, thinking, I thought I was just saving the environment. It's absurd, it's camp, it's entirely anime, and yet somehow it doesn't break the game. I think the reason it works, and the reason it's so relatable, is because it humanises the stakes. If the game was just 40 hours of brooding in the rain, you'd eventually go numb from the drama, but by forcing you to participate in a military parade, or race giant yellow birds called Chocobos, or engage in a slap fight on top of a giant cannon, the game reminds you that this world is actually worth living in. It's a world that contains joy and stupidity alongside the tragedy. The Gold Saucer is the peak of the madness. It's a literal neon theme park floating in the desert where you play basketball minigames and ride roller coasters while the world literally bleeds out below you. I spend 2 hours trying to breed a better bird because the game made me care about the nonsense just as much as the narrative. It's a brand of humour that feels very specific in the 90s square era. It's confident enough to be silly. It knows the characters are blocky puppets, so it leans into the physical comedy of their animations. There is a charm in seeing Barrett, a man with a literal gun for an arm, being forced to do a date with Cloud at a Ferris wheel because you made the wrong dialogue choices. As an outsider, I've realised that this whiplash is actually the heart of the game. It's the light that makes the shadows of Sephiroth feel darker. You aren't just a soldier, you're a person in a weird, messy, beautiful world. And if you have to dress up like a member of the Shinra infantry and perform a synchronised rifle routine to get to the next plot point, well, you have to do it with a smile, even if it makes absolutely no sense. Even if you spent your entire life under a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, you probably know that Final Fantasy VII contains a moment of genuine tragedy. It is the Snape kills Dumbledore of the gaming world, a spoiler so ambiguous that it's basically part of the cultural furniture. Going into this as a first timer, I assumed I was immune to it. I figured that since I knew it was coming, I could maintain my dry analytical distance. I thought I could just watch the polygons collide and move on to the next entry in the index. I was wrong. The emotional pivot of this game doesn't just happen in a cutscene, it happens in your inventory. Throughout the first half of the journey, you spend dozens of hours investing in your party. You carefully slot materia into their weapons, you learn their limits, and you develop a tactical rhythm that relies on the Pacific presence. When the game finally pulls the rug from under you, it isn't just a narrative blow, it's a mechanical amputation. Suddenly, the healer you've spent hours perfecting is gone, and you're left looking at the empty slot of your menu that feels like a physical bruise. I'm used to characters dying, but usually they die because I messed up. They die because I ran out of ammo or failed a dodge. In Final Fantasy VII, the death is a scripted, inevitable cruelty. It's the game telling you that no matter how much you grind, no matter how many levels you gain, you cannot save everyone. For the first timer, that realisation is the moment the game stops being a toy and starts being a story. I found myself sitting in the silence of the Forgotten City, watching the white materia bounce slowly into the water, and I realised I wasn't thinking about my next game list anymore. I was just there. The music, Aerith's theme continues to play even as you're thrust into a boss fight immediately afterwards, forcing you to fight through your own shock. It is a masterful, manipulative, and deeply human piece of game design. It uses your own mechanical attachment to a character against you. This is the point where the stakes shifted for me. The planet is dying plotline, which had previously felt like an abstract and high concept, suddenly became personal. I didn't care about the live stream or the central lore anymore. I just wanted to finish what we started. It turned my outsider curiosity into a genuine obsession. I stopped being a guy documenting a list and started being a guy on a mission. It's the pivot that every great epic needs. It's the moment the hero loses their safety net and has to decide if they're going to keep walking into the dark. For me, it was the moment I stopped looking at my watch. I realised that Final Fantasy VII wasn't just a landmark because of its graphics or its sales. It was a landmark because it had the guts to make a million teenagers feel a profound sense of loss over a collection of pixels. And 30 years later, even for a cynical survival horror veteran, that loss still has weight you can feel in your chest. There is a physical ritual to the PlayStation era that we've lost in the age of digital downloads and terabyte hard drives. The CD swap. When that black screen finally appears and asks you to insert disc 2, it's not just a technical requirement, it's a milestone. It's the game taking a breath and asking you, are you still with me? For a game of this magnitude, moving from one disc to the next feels like crossing a border into a new country. As I sat there swapping over to that next disc, I realised how much my relationship with the game had changed. I had moved past the culture shock of the menus and the LEGO aesthetics. I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was deep in the trenches of the endgame. The grind had set in, but for the first time in my life, I didn't mind the work. I found myself wandering the snowy fields of the northern continent, seeking out fights just to see my materia hit that master level. Like a man possessed by the very math I used to avoid. There is a specific kind of madness that takes over when you reach a final third of Final Fantasy VII. The world map, which once felt overwhelming, now feels like your personal backyard. You get the high wind, the massive airship, and suddenly the entire planet is yours to traverse in seconds. You start hunting down the weapons, those optional mountain-sized bosses that look like something out of a fever dream, and you realise the game has shifted once again. It's no longer about the story, it's about power. It's about seeing how far you can push the systems until they break. I went from a guy who was scared of a mechanical scorpion to a god slayer who could summon a comet to level a forest. But the game never lets you get too comfortable. Even as you're flying your airship and feeling invincible, the giant meteor hangs in the sky, a constant red reminder that the clock is still ticking. It's a brilliant bit of visual pressure that keeps the endgame from feeling like a victory lap. The grind is where the human element of the player is tested. It's the late nights, the repetitive music, and the slow realisation that you are nearing the end of the journey that has redefined your understanding of the console. I found myself stalling. I didn't want to go to the northern crater. I didn't want to finish the fight, because finishing the fight meant leaving the world behind me. For a guy who usually loves a short and sweet experience, this was the ultimate revelation. The 3-disc structure of the PS1 era was a physical manifestation of abomination. It told you, this story is too big for one piece of plastic. And as I prepped my party for the final descent, checking my Materia links one last time and ensuring everyone had the best gear, I realised that I wasn't just checking off another entry of the index. I was finishing a marathon. I was tired, my eyes were dry from staring at the screen, and I had a notebook full of scribbled stats. But I had never felt more like a gamer in my entire life. As the final notes of the one-winged angel faded into the hum of my TV, and the credits began to roll, I realised I was sitting in a different room than the one I started in. Not literally, of course. The walls were the same, and the smell of the stale coffee hadn't changed, but my perspective on what a PlayStation could do had been completely rebuilt from the ground up. I came into this as a skeptic. I was a guy who didn't have time for 60-hour epics or turn-based math. I thought Final Fantasy VII was a monolith built on nostalgia, a game that people only love because they played it when they were 10. But after 70 hours of Midgar grime, Materia management, and genuine grief of the Forgotten City, I have to admit it, I was wrong. The Legend isn't just noise, it's a masterpiece of pacing, atmosphere, and the human connection that transcends its own blocky polygons. I finally understand why these 3 black discs changed everything. They didn't just sell consoles, they sold the idea that a video game could be a life-changing event. For the first time in the PSX Index, I didn't feel like I was documenting a piece of history, I felt like I was living in it. I've traded my cynicism for a genuine respect of the long play. I might still prefer the tension of a narrow hallway and limited inventory, but I no longer fear the blue menu box. I've climbed the mountain, and the view from the top was worth every second of the grind. But the Index waits for no one, and the journey is far from over. After the cosmic stakes of saving the planet, it's time to head back to a more familiar territory. Next time, we're looking at the black sheep of the legendary family. It's a game that tried to bend the survival horror I love with a first-person perspective that no one expected. It's the final Resident Evil title on the PlayStation, and we're tackling it just weeks before the world moves on to Resident Evil Requiem. It's time to see if this series can survive a change in perspective. We're picking up a gun con and heading into Sheena Island. It's time for Resident Evil Survivor. 46 games down, 1,232 to go. Get ready for Survivor.